Thanks, everyone. All right, so thank you all for being here today. My name is Dr. Melanie Stock. I run the USU Small Farms Lab. I'm a soil scientist by training, but a lot of the work that we do for small farms is developing cut flower production methods to kind of improve yield and harvest timing. And so since 2019, we've been studying dahlias, and more than a few times I've wanted to give up on this crop. It's one that it can be very productive, but there's a lot of challenges to try to optimize it here in Utah. So I'm actually kind of thinking it's probably going to be a cut flower in all of my trials for the next like 25 years. There's so much to study. So today I want to talk just a little bit about what we've been up to, and especially talk about last year and some of the trials. I want to acknowledge the other co-authors here on this presentation because they helped out a ton and ran a lot of these trials. I'm just reporting on it. As well as thank you to our sponsors. So a little quick roadmap for today. I have to apologize, I'm going to talk a bit fast just because there's so much I want to share with you here. But this will all be recorded and you can take a look back later if you would like. So first I'll just talk a little bit about what we already know about dahlias, why they're worth studying, and then I'll spend the most time on our key trials, which is looking at soil nutrient management as well as protected cultivation methods. And then some of the things that we observed along the way. So without further ado, trying to grow dahlias in Utah, the good, the bad-ish, and the ugly. So the good is that there is so much potential with dahlias. They can command premium pricing. They're one of the most desired cut flowers by florists from local farms. And it's also a major summer to fall crop for our local cut flower farms. So they're definitely worth studying. Once they start blooming, they continue blooming until our first frost. And so there's this tremendous yield potential if we could just unlock it and maybe get them to bloom a little bit sooner and a little bit more, especially when we think about our big dinner plate varieties that tend to come in so late. But the challenge is that they have a very narrow ideal range for temperatures. And those of us here in Utah, we reach really high temperatures during the day and pretty low temperatures at night. And so there's this question about how can we modify our temperatures for field production more within the range that dahlias want to try to increase yield and the timing of that yield. And then the thing that's kind of thwarted all of this in the mix is disease and just how prevalent viruses are in dahlias and how difficult it is to be able to acquire clean stock. And I like to think or say that no matter what production trial I can come up with, viruses can always outdo me. And so it's a way of trying to figure out how do we work with clean stock so that we can actually improve upon production. And we kind of unlocked this past year. And I'm really thankful for Dr. Claudia Nischwitz, our plant pathologist, who's gotten really into cut flowers and trying to nail down those diseases and management approaches. So this is why we're interested in studying dahlias. There's actually been a fair amount of research that's been done, and in fact, it's been conducted by one of the most famous plant physiologists of all time, Dr. Royal Hines. He's looked a lot at photoperiod and temperature for dahlia. So this is the highest level of research. And so what he's found is that photoperiod really doesn't affect flowering. It's not going to make a difference for bloom timing. But we do know that as the days get shorter, that does promote tuberization, especially when the temperatures start decreasing. So as our day lengths get shorter and temperatures are dropping, that plant is going to start tuberizing. But really, he found 12 to 14 hours per day is ideal for flowering, and that's great for us here in Utah because we hit that in May all through late September. The ideal temperature range is in the low 70s. There's a bit more on temperature. Soil temperature can actually matter a lot for dahlia production. There's some studies that said around 95 degrees Fahrenheit that just ceases all cut flower, or all dahlia flowering. So we know this is the range that they like, and we know this is the range that we don't really hit in the summertime. And so right off the bat, when we're thinking about trying to increase yield, we're thinking about, all right, how do we get into that ideal temperature range? Now, if we look at the other two kind of inputs for production, next is fertilizer. How much nutrients do we put down? What about here in Utah? And those of you tuning in who know me know that this is kind of my soapbox. And so we're going to talk about this more in the next couple of slides. But basically, academic research as well as grower and industry guides are all over the place. There's a lot of warnings that, yeah, it's a heavy feeder, but if you put too much nitrogen down, you're going to delay flowering, they're going to have weak stems and so forth. A lot of grower guides are recommending adding phosphorus and potassium. Some even say you need more P and K than you do N. But I wanted to highlight, of all the sources, the American Dahlia Society had a kind of a casual article that was generally recommending around 175 pounds of N per acre. On a smaller scale, that translates to 4 pounds per 1,000 square feet. But that overall, they found nationally growers were adding about 3 times as much. So that's another thing we're going to chat about in the next slide here. But that's a lot of nitrogen. That is a heavy feeder if we're thinking that that might be our optimal rate. And then lastly, in thinking about irrigation, these recommendations are even more vague and all over the place than fertilizer recommendations are. I see 1 inch per week a lot of warnings about not overdoing it on irrigation or the tubers may rot. Some just talk about watering for an hour per irrigation event and maybe doing that 3 times per week, which to me raises the question, how much water is that? Because the amount I can put down in an hour might be very different from somebody else, depending on the irrigation system, the flow rating for drip and so forth. And then just kind of putting that in perspective here in Utah, the reference ET, or kind of the water demand for turf grass, is 0.3 inches per day in peak summer. And I say that because turf is short and dahlias can be 4 or 5 feet tall. They're producing all these blooms and they're producing tubers. I think that 1 inch per week might be a bit conservative coming out of Iowa and elsewhere out east. So there's a lot to contend with when we're talking about and considering increasing production. So our project goals are to look at nutrient management. This comes from being concerned about the bottom line, that we're not spending extra money on fertilizer, nutrients, or amendments that we don't need. And then also looking at protected cultivation methods to try to get us in that temperature range that we know that dahlias will produce better in. So that's what I'm going to talk about here. So nutrient management. We have a pretty good idea of what phosphorus and potassium should be. We can kind of give a baseline recommendation for that, but nitrogen is the one that we really don't have good data on. In fact, the researchers in the past have recommended anywhere from 40 to 400 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So we want to try to hone in on that, and especially under Utah soil conditions. And so what I wanted to kind of show you, we've been doing a lot of soil surveys across Utah, particularly along the Wasatch Front. And so when you do a soil test, by the way, if you live in Utah, Utah State has an analytical lab. This is our website right here. If you're tuning in from out of state, make sure to send your soil to your own state's lab, just because our soil test methods vary depending on where you live and what your soils are like. But for here in Utah, there's different things you can request. So P, phosphorus, potassium, nitrogen, and I have salinity up here. Now down here are what our recommended values are. So for example, for phosphorus, we want to be between 21 and 30. Any more than that, it's not going to help the plant. So when we've done our surveys, we found for typical urban farms and community gardens, a lot of vegetable growers, I've got the average values that we're finding as well as the min and the max. So the range around that. You can see for P, we're about 3 times on average what we should be, and salinity is kind of creeping up. Now, if we aggregate all of the cut flower farm soil tests, you can see we're higher yet. So we tend to really love our soil, right? And we've got, whenever we're in these small farm situations, it's easy to just love it a lot and want to put on a lot of soil amendments, compost, manures, fertilizers. And that can lead us down a road that can be a bit unfortunate down the road even further, because a lot of the nutrients in the soil actually count as salts too. So they can contribute to soil salinity, and many of our cut flowers are very sensitive to elevated soil salinity. So they usually start to decrease production around 2. 2 is our magic number. So overall, we tend to come in a bit high on our soil test values. So this right away means that we can actually probably cut back a little bit, which will only help our bottom line and will only help our long-term soil sustainability. All right, soapbox over. let's take a look at our end study. So in Cache Valley, we've been running this study since 2019. I'm going to share 2021 results because we acquired almost virus-free stock. So it's the easiest to take a look at the numbers. A little bit of information here. We are growing cafe au lait. We have to plant them after our last frost. And then we trialed these 5 different rates. So from 0 to 200 pounds per acre. Remember, American Dahlia Society was around 175 for their recommendation, or thinking about that on a smaller scale here, 1 to 5 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. And the way that we applied it was we did a split application, which means we applied half of that nitrogen about a week before planting and we tilled it in. And then we did the other half when we saw buds, but a good week before first harvest. So once we start harvesting, we don't want to be adding more nitrogen. So we split that rate up. And here are our results. This graph shows our harvest from late July through October by the different nitrogen rates. So 0 would be that we didn't apply any nitrogen. And then these are our increasing rates with this 150 to 200 pounds per acre or 3 to 5 pounds per 1,000 square feet coming in right around the same amount. And so we're still crunching the numbers on this. Statistically, this is really not a difference. Even if you get a little bit more production, it's not worth the cost of the fertilizer to creep it up to 200. 150 is looking about right on the money here, which isn't so surprising. We tend to accumulate nutrients a little bit better than they do out east, but that's still a pretty high rate. So our recommendation is to apply early in the season. I like to think about it as giving that plant the gas, really pushing it along, but back off after it starts blooming. You don't want to be adding nitrogen at that point. Be sure to try to calculate rates instead of using intuition. If you do a soil test, you might find you only need nitrogen. If you're interested, we release this fact sheet. If you Google the title, it'll come right up. We can release the link for it too. But this walks you through how do you calculate the right amount to add. So based on the fertilizer you're choosing and the size of your beds, you're probably not growing an acre of dahlias or even 1,000 square feet. So this can walk you through how to calculate that out. And I can also give you a hand too if you email me. One other piece of data from this study here is that we also looked at the tuber weight when we harvested them at the end of the year. And so this is by each of the different N rates from low to high. And so perhaps some of that extra nitrogen was actually going into tuber production. We haven't done the statistics on this. My guess is this isn't going to come out to be significant though. So anyway, a little bit on that. Now switching gears into talking about protected cultivation. We've been looking at high tunnels versus field here in North Logan. That's the first thing I wanted to talk about with protected cultivation. And Megan touched on this quite a bit, and I appreciate that, just on how high tunnels can help us control the temperature for field production. I love this picture here. These are our peonies. We've removed plastic from the high tunnel. Here's an example in back with a high tunnel that still has plastic on it. And then here, off to the side, there's shade cloth. And so we've got all these different combinations of covers or no cover that we can use to try to moderate temperature and get it into the range that we're looking for. Nice fact sheet on how to put together these low-cost high tunnels. So this past year, we were able to acquire 2 decorative types that were relatively virus-free. So we didn't do dinner plates this year, but we planted in the high tunnel in late April and the field in late May. And this is what we found. So we've got our harvest timing from July through October with our 2 varieties. And so the dashed line means it was grown in a high tunnel and the solid lines mean it was grown in the field, with the different colors representing each variety. And so you can see that even though we just planted a week before, a month before in the high tunnel, we harvested about 7 weeks. We started harvesting about 7 weeks sooner than we did in the field. Our field trial this year had a lot of issues. It was, we planted them cuttings in late May, and then we had that really oppressive June, really hot temperatures that was hard to establish the plants. We had a lot die off, and it really kind of pushed them back, as well as some watering issues too. So overall, we're able to advance harvest significantly, continue it after frost, also after freak snowstorms, to really push yield potential. So the high tunnel's been successful for Dahlia production. If we look at the marketability, so here in the graph, we're looking at the total stems on average that we're harvesting per plant. Here, we're breaking that into, okay, but what percent of those can we actually consider marketable? And you can see that the high tunnel really pushed up our marketability by being able to increase the stem length. All right. So the second protected cultivation study we did was conducted in Salt Lake, thanks to Katie Wagner, Mark Brenneman, and Amanda Pratt, who ran this trial. And here we're looking at black versus white plastic mulch. So in our Cache Valley trial, we didn't use mulch, by the way. And then on top of the plastic mulch, we did shade versus no shade, which you can see in this picture in the upper right-hand corner, which we achieved with extended low tunnels, knowing that a lot of our growers can't fit a high tunnel in. And so this was conducted at Wheeler Historic Farm. The soil is quite sandy there. And so we actually changed up our fertigation method. Instead of just doing a split application, we actually were applying it every 7 to 10 days. We ended up hitting about 170 pounds of N per acre. And we trialed with 2 varieties. So Syngenta gifted us a bunch of virus-free cafe au laits. And then we also bought some uncertified tubers that were stuck in the mail for a while. So we planted a bit late. And so what we found then in looking at mulch and shade combinations with our 2 cultivars, so here we've got Cafe au lait on top with Luna on the bottom, and then our harvest date from August through October. And again, it's later because we planted later. The gray lines mean that the plants were grown in white plastic, and the black lines mean they were grown in black plastic, with the dashes representing there was shade present, and then the solid line means it was grown in full sun. And so right away, Cafe au lait's yield is higher. It could be because it's a different cultivar. It's also it's very likely it's because it didn't have so many viruses. But you can see that actually what really made the difference was growing on white plastic mulch. And so we had actually had temperature sensors under that mulch. Those are still on the ground for another study. And so we have to analyze those data yet. But the white plastic made a difference more so than shade. But shade on top of black plastic mulch really helped us establish plants better and also help with that early production until temperatures cooled off. With La Luna, it was interesting because the white plastic with shade really helped us advance production. So there's a lot we still need to analyze in terms of temperature and how those plants were responding. But just visually, the plants seem to grow a lot more with white plastic mulch plus shade. In looking at marketability then, so this is the graphs are showing the total number of stems we harvested per plant. This is the percent that would have been marketable. There wasn't really a difference across the different treatments. And then similarly, if we look at this average stem length of the marketable blooms by each of these 4 treatments of white or black plastic mulch plus or minus shade with the 2 cultivars, in general, La Luna could get a little bit longer stems, but there's no trend here really. There's just not a significant difference happening in stem length across these different treatments. So from this, what we're finding is there's a lot of temperature information to still tease out, but it's looking like it's changing our timing a bit, as well as our total yield. And then lastly, I wanted to touch on just some observations in trial and error that we've been through the last few years as we're trying to optimize Dahlia cut flower production. And so the first thing is just staking. And I feel like throughout our trials, we've tried a lot of different methods to stake and finding out what's best. Definitely found out you need to stake them for sure, even though they can seem quite robust. They're very subject to wind throw. They also have hollow stems. And as a result of that, they are prone to breakage. That can happen at very inopportune times. And then they're also gravitropic. So once they kind of fall over, those stems are going to bend to try to go straight. And then that makes a culled stem. We can't market that. So they need something. Throughout our travels too, we've seen different farms and what they've done and been really impressed. This is a beautiful farm with dahlias where they've got C-posts every few feet. And then they're using string to kind of corral them in. There's a general kind of square around the bed and then a diagonals going through. We tried methods with baling twine around our dahlias in the past, but our absolute favorite method, and this carries through with snapdragons and lisianthus and stock and everything else, is this horizontal trellis. So this is about a 6-inch mesh, I guess, or grid type trellis. It's plastic. We use it year after year. We get a good 3 to 5 years out of it. And so what we really liked, this is an example in the high tunnel, that even though there's not wind in the high tunnel, we still need to use trellis. Whereas outside in the field, there's really strong winds. We're at the mouth of a canyon. So under high wind conditions, this worked best, where we installed the first layer of it about a foot off the ground. And then as the plants grew, we put the second row of trellis about 2 to 3 feet off the ground, depending on the height of the plants that we were reaching. And we were able to really optimize our stem straightness that way. So that was our favorite way to do some trellising or staking. And we wrote this little fact sheet in the fall if you're interested. It's called Low Tunnels for Field Cut Flower Production, but it gets into it gets into staking and trellising, and it gets into extending low tunnels for really tall cut flower crops like dahlias. So if you Google that title, it'll come right in, and we can also send out links for these after the conference. Ooh, excuse me. Then secondly, I wanted to just quick mention irrigation, because the recommendations that are out there are rough, and I hope that this is something we can continue to study. But this past year, we had studies in 3 locations, and I've talked a bit about our Cache Valley and Salt Lake trials. But we started to just track how much water we were adding based on our soil moisture sensors, and it really varies based on management approaches and the cultivars you're growing. But in Logan, we were between 2 and 4 inches per week. Most of these trials were irrigating every other day to reach around 2 to 4 inches. So 2 inches would have been in May when it's cooler, or September, whereas 4 inches is in the peak of the season. Kaysville was a study ran by Dr. Nishwitz, sandier soil. And then in Salt Lake, it's a very sandy soil, and we also use mulching. And so just thinking that 1 inch of water, I wouldn't trust it. And that water really can change the timing that the blooms come on, and can slow them down too, if we're not keeping up. And so with that, I just have a few minutes left here. So to summarize, I want to say that overall, our soil test values are a bit high on cut flower farms, and just in thinking about long-term production and soil health, it really would help to reduce the amount of inputs going in. So whether that's through soil amendments or starting to calculate exact fertilizer rates, those all could help. Our trials are showing that around 150 pounds of N per acre, so 3 pounds per 1,000 square feet, that's tending to be the right amount for dahlias, where we're really giving them the gas, but we're not overdoing it. And then following soil test recommendations for P and K. I wouldn't just add these without doing a soil test, because chances are there's probably enough in the ground, because our soil tends to accumulate it as compared to out east. Think about what temperatures are at your farm and what the optimal ranges are for dahlias, and ways to try to bring those into that optimal zone for a longer period of time, whether that's through shade or high tunnels or so forth. We have more research to do on that, but it's looking promising. And then some trials that we have underway right now, we're doing a storage trial at Wheeler Historic Farm, and we're going to continue doing the low tunnel and mulch here in 2022. And then we're hoping we can get more into water management and viruses, because we just wrote some more grants for that. And so with that, I have a minute left. Let's release the poll for me. I can send that. Please fill out the survey. And then if there's any questions, maybe I can answer just one before the next talk.
So there were a couple. Why did you use plastic mulch instead of organic?
So organic mulch would be like straw or one of those kinds. I'm assuming is what organic mulch means. We're interested in plastic mulch because of how it will affect soil temperature. Organic mulch can be a great way to keep the soil cooler, but it also can introduce, and I really like it because it's a way to increase organic matter in the soil as well. But when we get into large scale farming, plastic mulch is one of the most used methods. It can help suppress weeds and all other kind of things. And so that was our decision for using plastic mulch. But it'd be interesting to look at organic mulch too. But also with all of the disease problems dahlias have, it was a little safer to go on the plastic mulch side. So keep these questions